When my husband died, I stood in the kitchen and felt something I had not felt in 40 years. Relief. My name is Dorothy. I am 68 years old and I have been a widow for 14 months. And I want to tell you something that I have never said out loud to anyone except my 2 children and one friend who already knew without being told. I want to tell you because I think there are women listening to this right now who will understand exactly what I mean. And I want them to know they are not alone and they are not monsters and what they feel is not wrong. My husband Gerald died on a Tuesday morning in February 14 months ago. He was sitting in his armchair in the living room watching the morning news, which is what he did every morning, and then he wasn't watching it anymore. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack. They said it was fast. They said he likely didn't feel much, which is the thing people say in those moments because they are kind and because there is nothing else useful to say. I thanked them and I signed what I needed to sign and I called my daughter first and then my son, and then I sat down on the couch in that living room with the television still on and the armchair still empty and I felt the air in that house change. Like something had been pressing down on everything for a very long time and had suddenly, without warning, lifted. I want to tell you about Gerald. Not the Gerald that people knew from outside. The Gerald who was charming at dinner parties and remembered everyone's names and always picked up the check and made people laugh with that easy confidence he had in social situations. I want to tell you about the Gerald I lived with for 41 years, behind the door of our house, where the charm stayed outside and what came in with him every evening was something else entirely. He never hit me. I want to say that clearly because I know that when people hear the word abuse they picture something visible, something that leaves marks, something that can be photographed and pointed to. Gerald never left a mark on me. What he did was quieter than that and in some ways harder to explain. And for most of our marriage I couldn't have explained it at all because I had been so thoroughly convinced that everything was my fault and my perception was wrong and I was too sensitive and I didn't understand things properly. It started early. Within the first year of our marriage I noticed that Gerald had very particular ideas about how things should be done and very little patience for any deviation from those ideas. Not violent ideas, not dramatic ideas, just this constant low-level certainty that his way was right and my way was wrong and the gap between those two things was always somehow my failure. If I cooked dinner and it wasn't exactly what he wanted, the problem was my judgment. If I spent money on something for the house, the problem was my priorities. If I laughed too loudly at a party or talked too much to someone he didn't like or wore something he found inappropriate, the problem was always, in one way or another, me. He never shouted. That's the thing that made it so hard to name for so long. Gerald was not a shouting man. He was a quiet, precise man who expressed his displeasure in complete sentences, in a calm and measured tone, in a way that always sounded entirely reasonable and always left me feeling like I had somehow misunderstood something obvious that any sensible person would have grasped immediately. He had a particular look he gave me when I said something he found foolish, not angry, just patient, the way a teacher is patient with a very slow student, and over the years that look did more damage than any raised voice could have done. I stopped having opinions. That's the clearest way I can describe what happened over the first decade of our marriage. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and completely, the way a plant stops growing when it doesn't get enough light. I stopped suggesting restaurants because he always had a better reason for somewhere else. I stopped buying clothes I liked because he always had a comment. I stopped calling friends as often because he always found something slightly wrong with them, some reason they weren't quite right, and it was easier to agree than to defend people I cared about to a man who would simply wait with that patient look until I ran out of things to say. We had 2 children. My daughter Ellen was born in 1981, and my son Paul in 1984. They are 43 and 40 now, and they are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I say that with a completeness that I cannot fully express. Gerald was not cruel to them the way he was to me. Children, I think, were a category he understood differently, something to be proud of rather than managed, but they grew up in that house and they saw things. Children always see things. Ellen told me years later that she used to watch my face when Gerald came home in the evenings to figure out what kind of night it was going to be. She said she got very good at reading me in the first 30 seconds. She was 7 years old when she learned to do that, and that fact sits in me like a stone that will never fully dissolve. I thought about leaving. Many times over many years I thought about it. I had the conversation in my head hundreds of times, what I would say, where I would go, how I would manage. But Gerald had a way of making the practical logistics of independence feel impossible. He handled all the finances. I had a small amount of money in an account he knew about and monitored and commented on, and I had nothing else. I had been out of the workforce for so long that the idea of finding a job at 55 or 60 felt like something that happened to other people. And besides, I knew what Gerald would say if I tried. I knew exactly how he would frame it, calmly, reasonably, with that patient voice, and I knew after 40 years of being shaped by that voice, that some part of me would believe him. So I stayed. Not happily, not peacefully, but with the particular quiet endurance of someone who has decided that this is simply their life and the best thing to do is get through each day as well as possible. And then one Tuesday morning in February he sat down in his armchair and didn't get up again. And I felt the air in the house change. The first person I called after my children was our neighbor Margaret, who had been my closest friend for 22 years and who arrived at my door within 15 minutes with her coat still half on and her keys still in her hand. She came in and she looked at me and she didn't say anything for a moment, and then she put her arms around me and held on, and I stood there in that hallway and I didn't cry. I waited for it. I expected it to come the way it comes in films and in other people's lives, the wave, the collapse, the grief arriving like weather. But it didn't come. There was just that strange lightness, that change in the air. And underneath it something very quiet that I didn't have a name for yet. Margaret pulled back and looked at my face and she said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "I don't know." And she nodded just once, in a way that told me she understood more than I had said. Margaret had known. Not everything, not the details, because I had never been able to give her the details, partly because I couldn't find the language and partly because saying it out loud felt like an accusation I wasn't sure I had the right to make against a man who had never raised his hand to me. But she had been in my kitchen enough times and at enough dinners and had watched Gerald's face enough times when I spoke to know that something in our house was not right. She never pushed. She just stayed close for 22 years, and I think now that staying close was the most important thing anyone did for me during that time. The funeral was 6 days after he died. It was a large funeral because Gerald had many acquaintances and because he had been, to the outside world, a genuinely likable man. People came who hadn't seen us in years. They shook my hand and said he was wonderful and they were so sorry and what a shock and he seemed so healthy and I smiled and said thank you and meant none of it and felt guilty for meaning none of it and then felt something sharper than guilt, a kind of exhausted impatience with the performance of grief I was apparently supposed to be giving. Ellen stayed with me for the first 2 weeks. She slept in the guest room and made coffee every morning and sat with me in the evenings, and on the third night she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Mom, you don't have to pretend with me." Just that. Quietly and directly, the way Ellen has always been, and something in my chest came loose when she said it. I told her then. Not everything at once, it came out over several evenings, slowly and in pieces, the way things come out when you have kept them for a very long time and your body isn't quite sure it's safe to let them go. I told her about the look. I told her about the money. I told her about the 30 years of small corrections and quiet dismissals and the patient voice that had, over decades, convinced me that my own judgment was fundamentally unreliable. I told her about the times I had thought about leaving and why I hadn't. I told her about standing in the kitchen on the morning he died and feeling the air change. Ellen listened without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "I know, Mom. I've known for a long time. We both have." She meant herself and Paul. We talked about it, Paul and I. Years ago. We didn't know how to bring it to you without making things worse for you. I sat with that for a moment. My children had been carrying this alongside me, separately, in their own way for years. The thought of it made me want to cry in a way that Gerald's death hadn't, and so I did cry, right there at the kitchen table, and Ellen came around and sat next to me and didn't say anything useful or comforting because there wasn't anything useful or comforting to say, and that was exactly right. Paul came down the following weekend. He is quieter than his sister and takes longer to get to things, but he got there. He sat across from me on the Sunday morning with his coffee and he said, "I want you to know that whatever you're feeling right now is okay. All of it. You don't owe anyone a particular kind of grief." He said it simply and without drama, and it was the most generous thing anyone said to me in those weeks, and I have thought about it many times since. The months after Gerald died were strange in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were practical things to manage, finances, paperwork, the house, and for the first time in 40 years I was managing them myself, and what I discovered was that I was capable. More than capable. I opened accounts and made decisions and called people I needed to call and figured things out, and every time I did something successfully I felt a small, almost embarrassing flicker of something that took me a while to identify. Pride. I was feeling pride in my own competence at 68 years old, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I started walking in the mornings. Long walks alone without asking anyone's permission or explaining where I was going or when I'd be back. I started cooking things I wanted to eat rather than things I had learned over decades were least likely to provoke a comment. I called friends I hadn't spoken to in years, women I had drifted away from gradually, in the way you drift away from people when your life becomes about managing someone else's moods. Some of them had wondered. A few of them said so carefully, and I let them say it, and I didn't defend Gerald because I was finished defending Gerald. I want to be honest about something. There were moments in those early months when the guilt came. Not grief, not exactly, but guilt, the sense that I should be feeling something other than what I was feeling, that a woman who loses her husband of 41 years should be devastated, and I was not devastated, and what did that make me? I talked about it with Margaret one afternoon in her kitchen, and she listened to all of it, and then she said, "Dorothy, you grieved that marriage for 40 years while he was still in it. You don't have to grieve it again now." I have thought about that sentence almost every day since she said it. It has been 14 months. The house is mine now, completely and quietly mine. And I have learned what it feels like to walk into a room without calculating anyone else's mood first. I have learned what it feels like to make a decision and trust it. I have learned at 68 years old what it feels like to have an ordinary Tuesday morning that belongs entirely to me. Last week Ellen called to check in the way she does every few days, and she asked how I was, and I said, "I'm good, sweetheart. I'm genuinely good." And she was quiet for a second, and then she said, "I know, Mom. I can hear it." And then she said, "I'm glad." And I said, "Me too." And we stayed on the phone a little longer than we needed to, just talking, the way we do now that there is nothing in the house to be careful about. And that was enough. That was more than enough.